The Imperial Japanese Navy entered World War II with, technically speaking, some of the best prospects for submarine warfare, as long as you look purely at the capabilities of their submarine fleet. Their torpedoes mostly worked, unlike the US Navy's Mark 14. They were concentrated in a single operational theatre, unlike the Royal Navy, which was scattered across most of the planet. Their submarines included genuinely large and long-range units capable of far-distant operations, and they had them in reasonable numbers, unlike the Kriegsmarine, whose main U-boat type was one of the smallest that was ever used in true oceanic warfare during that particular conflict. And their opponent was having to operate, at least at the beginning, in large expanses of deep-water ocean where submarines could move and stalk easily, unlike the Regia Marina, which was mostly confined to the relatively small and shallow Mediterranean. Yet, of all these submarines' arms, the Imperial Japanese Navy's underwater combat record is not massively impressive outside of a handful of admittedly spectacular incidents. So why was this? Before we look at the Japanese Navy's submarine campaign during the war, it's necessary to understand not only what they had to hand, but why and how they intended to use it. Japanese experience with submarines actually went back quite a long way, having come into possession of their first submarine, at one of the later Holland types, even before the Russo-Japanese War was fully underway. Although they didn't get to use that submarine in the Russo-Japanese War, they had subsequently mixed construction of their own subs based on foreign designs, with purchases from overseas, especially from their allies at the time, the British, and towards the end of the 1910s, they received a number of U-boats as spoils of war. However, due to the limitations of submarines during the 1900s and 1910s, combined with the sheer size of the Pacific Ocean, the first thoughts on the use of the Japanese submarines were as craft for maintaining the blockade of enemy ports on the Asian mainland, a sort of mobile minefield scenario, or alternatively for use as blockade runners or blockade breakers if the enemy turned up off of Japanese ports. Whilst only peripherally involved in anti-submarine operations during World War I, thanks to deployment by a number of cruisers and destroyers to the Mediterranean, the Japanese Navy had absorbed a lot of reports from the Royal Navy on the effect of submarines on the latter's operations, including, of course, both the effects on merchant ships and the perceived threat to warships when they were operating in large fleets, the effect of supposed U-boat sightings on the Grand Fleet, both in major engagements like Jutland and in more general cruising about, being particularly noted. Going into the interwar period, the relationship between Japan and the UK began to break down following the Washington Naval Treaty and the end of the Anglo-Japanese Naval Alliance, but by this point, the Japanese Navy's strategy had evolved alongside the increasing size and range of submarines, as represented by the latest and largest World War I types and some of the technological developments in the early 1920s. Ideally, they wanted a force that was capable of both raiding enemy commerce and attacking enemy warships, either independently or in cooperation and coordination with a fleet. But the funding simply wasn't there. Japan's economy was just that much smaller than its now main potential rival, the US Navy, and it was faced with a smaller submarine force than was considered necessary to meet both of these goals. And the increasing hold of the Kantai-Kessen decisive battle doctrine on Japanese thinking meant that it was decided that the submarine force should focus primarily on the destruction of enemy warships, which in any case was seen as the more prestigious of the two roles. This really began to crystallize when the Japanese Navy's submarines came under the leadership of Rear Admiral Nobumasa Suetsugu, I think. Although he was new to submarine operations, having spent World War I as an observer in foreign navies and as a gunnery officer, in the 1920s he proposed that his submarines should be able to destroy about a third of the US Navy's main combat power before the main decisive battle occurred. This was equivalent to sinking about 4 to 5 battleships. Those under his command who disagreed and felt that perhaps other strategies might be better or simply thought that his strategy was just unrealistic, would frequently find their careers stalling out at best or ending completely at worst. Thus able to enforce his vision, the first step of this strategy was proposed to consist of reconnaissance operations off of the ports that would be used by the US Asiatic Fleet. This would give the Japanese an idea of the strength of the closest enemy formation, as well as warning if it looked like they were about to make a move. The submarines would then lay minefields and pick off any survivors, crippling or destroying this portion of the US Navy, and thus preserving the main Japanese formations for battle against the main Pacific Fleet. With this accomplished, either those submarines or others would try to repeat the recon and mine-laying operations against the Pacific Fleet, bearing in mind that at this point in history they were based in Californian ports. Although there wasn't an expectation that the subs would be able to destroy the much larger Pacific Fleet. Once the Pacific Fleet sailed and cleared any minefields, the subs would become stealthy recon units for the Zengen Sakusen, a series of operations that the Japanese Navy as a whole planned to use to subject the Pacific Fleet to attrition on its way across the Pacific, reducing its numbers enough for the Japanese Navy's battle line to deal with whatever was left. This would be accomplished by establishing the subs in a series of trip lines, each of which ideally would be made up of a squadron of 10 submarines. As the Pacific Fleet crossed each line, the submarines would first signal the position of the enemy fleet to help direct the attack of Japanese destroyers and cruisers, followed by their own attacks of opportunity as the line collapsed in onto the US formation. Then, the submarines would follow the US fleet at a distance, taking out any damaged stragglers and keeping contact close enough to then rush in as a knife in the back when the decisive battle occurred. As the 1920s went on and Suesugu moved up to the Navy General Staff, he was able to influence more than just general strategy for submarines. It became quite clear rapidly that existing Japanese submarine technology was massively behind the capabilities that were needed to actually pull off any of these highly ambitious plans. To be fair, pretty much anyone's submarines, with the possible exception of that miracle unicorn of an actually working K-class, were in a similar position of not being able to fulfill the on-paper strategy. The submarines needed for this kind of mission would have to be considerably faster, especially on the surface, and massively more long-ranged, which also meant they would have to be considerably larger. The torpedoes they would launch would need to pack a greater punch and have a considerably greater range and speed to give the submarines the best chance when they got their salvos away of having a meaningful impact, since attacking warships, who would normally tend to have escorts, might mean they'd only get one shot in any given engagement. As aircraft gradually became more and more capable, this role also evolved into the idea of submarines carrying extra aviation fuel, allowing them to act as waypoints for long-range reconnaissance flying boats, which could then in theory spot targets for the submarines and radio them back. And then later on, this would lead to the idea of the submarines cutting out the middleman and supplying this capability organically with onboard aircraft. Both options being made possible by the sheer size of the submarines that were being drawn up. At the other end of the scale, midget subs were also planned. These could be transported by the larger submarines to the decisive battle area, where their deployment would multiply the number of Japanese underwater assets available to contain and strike at US Navy forces, their short range and low speed being less of a problem, given that in theory they'd be dropped off with the enemy at only a dozen or so miles away. This plan would continue to evolve and grew to include full units of subs directed solely to attack US forces in or outside of their ports as a main mission goal, as opposed to this being subordinated to the reconnaissance and mine-laying missions, which could now in theory be done by other submarines. This represented a combined plan that wouldn't actually change all that much between 1935, when the first calls for attack units off of American ports are mentioned, through to 1941. Commerce raiding was not entirely ignored as the submarine fleet grew, albeit that its relative position in the hierarchy could be discerned by orders that stated that submarines were free to conduct commerce raiding, providing it did not interfere with higher priority actions, i.e. attacking enemy battle fleets. Part of this seeming neglect of commerce raiding was simply that the Japanese Navy's overall war plans didn't envisage a long or medium-term war. The US Navy would be baited into sailing, it would be reduced by submarine, surface, and later aerial attacks, then it would be defeated, and then the US would be forced to seek terms and the war would be over in a matter of weeks, a few months at most. A war of this length meant that even an entirely successful commerce raiding operation would probably have negligible effect on the war's outcome as a whole, and against the United States, with its massive continental-based resources, commerce raiding would take a very long time to have a significant effect on anything other than long-distance fleet support and communications, which the Kantai-Kess indecisive battle doctrine was supposed to deal with far more quickly by making the need for long-distance fleet support and communications irrelevant by erasing the US battle fleet. Form, as they say, follows function, and so the Japanese Navy's submarine fleet was built up in the interwar period to fulfill the needs espoused by this naval philosophy. Japan divided its main submarines into 3 categories overall during World War II, first, second, and third class in descending order of size, roughly speaking. Most of the first-class submarines would eventually be made up of Junsen, or cruiser submarines, split into 4 broad groups, called either Junsen A, B, or C, or Type A, B, and C, depending on your preference and source. There were also the Type Js, which actually predate the Type As, as Type J simply stood for Junsen, and there were also the Type Ks, which stood for Kaidai, or Navy Large Type, which would be built throughout the interwar period and overlapped the construction of the Type Js, As, Bs, and Cs. There were the Type D Senyu Dais, which were large transport subs, the Kiraisen mine layers, a single Senho type tanker sub, and the famous Sentoku or I-400 submarine aircraft carriers, along with the Sentaka Dai large high-speed submarines, although some of these classes would only be built during World War II. Second-class submarines included the Type F, which appears to have just meant F in a rather pleasing change of pace, the Kaichu, or Navy medium types, the Type Ls, again apparently just meaning L, and the Sensho, or Senko, class point defense submarines. Third-class submarines would include the Senyūshō small transport subs and the Sentaka-shō small high-speed submarines. Both of these types would be built entirely during the Second World War. Midget subs of the Ko Hayoteki and Kairyu types, as well as the Kaiten manned torpedoes, fit into their own specialist niche. The development of this sometimes bewildering variety of submarines started out in 1924 when the Japanese Navy had 50 subs, about 80% of which were second-class vessels. There was a single first-class, Kadai 1, aka Submarine Number 44, aka I-51, which represented the entire long-range underwater strike capability of the Imperial Japanese Navy. However, with World War I meaning that a number of German U-boats were available to study, and there were a lot of suddenly unemployed German submarine designers on the market, the Japanese Navy rapidly hired over 800 of them and began the same kind of program that they'd done with their capital ships prior to World War I. Kadai 2, rather unsurprisingly, resembled the U-139 U-Kreuzer class, but significantly improved by almost a decade of technological progress. But again, like with their capital ship program pre-war, this would rapidly extend to mostly or wholly Japanese-designed submarines as lessons were rapidly learnt. The Kiraisen mine layers, derivatives of the UB-125 mine-laying type, would be the last class where one could easily spot German influence. The first of the Junsen Type Js featured something that most large Japanese submarines would have that distinguished them as almost unique in the world in terms of frontline operational subs: a scout plane complete with catapult and hangar. Torpedo size also increased. During World War I, most submarines had 18-inch diameter torpedoes or smaller. In the 1920s, along with most of the other major navies, the Japanese Navy adopted the 21-inch torpedo. By the mid-1930s, the technology underlying the larger 24-inch diameter Type 93 Long Lance was downscaled to the 21-inch Type 95, which is sometimes also called the Long Lance, which is technically incorrect, it's a Long Lance derivative, but nonetheless, compared to the primary submarine torpedo of the British and US navies, it was capable of either travelling about 13,000 yards at a setting of about 46 knots, or about 10,000 yards at a setting of about 50 knots, with an almost 900-pound warhead, whilst producing almost no bubble wake at all, thanks to the fact it used pure oxygen along with kerosene as a fuel system. It would, of course, also be modified in World War II, but this is the baseline mid-1930s stats. By contrast, the recently introduced US Mark 14, when it decided to work, could also make 46 knots, but only at the high-speed setting, and only over a distance of 4,500 yards, carrying an initial warhead in the mid-1930s of just over 500 pounds, and it left a wake. To get closer to the Type 95's high-speed run distance, although it still fell 10% short of that, the Mark 14 had to drop down to just over 30 knots. The British Mark 8 torpedo sat in the odd position of not initially having a low-speed setting, it just had one setting, that being 40 knots, which made it the slowest of the three, assuming that all three were tuned to run on high speed, or indeed for the Type 95, low speed as well. At 40 knots, the Mark 8 could travel 5,000 yards and carry a 750-pound warhead. It also left a wake like the Mark 14. Albeit that by the time the Mark 14 and Type 95 were introduced in the early to mid-1930s, the Mark 8, which had been introduced in the mid-1920s, had been largely superseded by the Mark 8 Double Star, which upped its 5,000-yard travel speed to just under 46 knots, and offered a lower speed 7,000-yard capable setting at 41 knots. Either way, the Type 95 was decidedly the superior weapon. The final generation of Junsen-type cruiser submarines were divided up, as we already mentioned, into the Type A, B, and C variants. But these were not sequential types with continuous improvement. Rather, the Type A meant that the submarine was a headquarters sub that had additional radio systems built in, was generally slightly bigger, and had a slightly longer range. The idea of the Type A's was to coordinate the movements of the Type B's, which were slightly smaller, and whose first role in an operation would be reconnaissance. Both the A's and B's would use their scout planes for these roles. They would then hand over the primary attack duty to the Type C's, which were very similar to the Type B's in overall size, but dropped the scout plane in exchange for the ability to carry more torpedoes, and a mounting cradle, which meant they could also carry a midget submarine. All three types could hit over 23 knots on the surface rather comfortably, which would enable rapid long-distance transit, although their most fuel-efficient cruising speed was 16 knots. All the submarines were capable of attacking enemy vessels, but the Type C's would lead this effort, with the B's and A's being in the next lines as the enemy advanced. The Type K's would also be used to supplement these designated roles, depending on the precise capability of the K type in question, as at the time the war started, the Type Ks consisted of numerous small batches of subs under various class designations, and of course, therefore having slightly different capabilities. Somewhat surprisingly, for all this work and doctrine and highly detailed design specification, the submarine crews simply practiced the basics of submarine operation, diving, surfacing, a little bit of torpedo operation, navigation, etc., almost in isolation, with no real effort to incorporate them into full fleet exercises on any significant basis until 1938, which immediately showed that the reality of the situation was far from ideal compared to the plans, and minimal engagement by the submarines in that particular exercise proved possible. Instead of reviewing the ideas they'd spent the better parts of 2 decades developing, and maybe changing them significantly, Japanese High Command simply tightened the submarines' orders on the basis that if they were only ever going to make a few engagements, these should therefore be against the highest value targets possible, and the main refinement to submarine tactics was to focus almost exclusively on slipping past lesser targets like destroyers and cruisers to deliver attacks only against enemy capital ships. Further exercises in 1939 and 1940 called into question whether submarine reconnaissance or submarine-launched aircraft reconnaissance of major enemy fleet bases would actually work to any great degree, and so that field of the plan was forced to also adapt its tactics very rapidly. Communications and coordination for the picket lines likewise proved in need of a lot of work. The big Japanese submarines did have the speed and endurance they needed for a picket line to home in on an enemy force once one of their number had spotted the incoming, but getting that message out to the submarines to tell them to start heading in the appropriate direction was far more complicated than had been assumed on paper. Notable in all this rush is a complete absence of any training in commerce raiding, which required a largely different set of tactics to accomplish successfully. That being said, having worked out that reality wasn't matching up with their plans, the Japanese Navy did spend most of 1940 and 1941 drilling their submarines relentlessly in all weathers and all other circumstances to try and refine their tactics to actually get something that was workable. So intense was this routine that I-161, 163 and 167 would all be lost in this period to operational accidents whilst on training missions. However, whilst this intense workout would lead to improvements, some factors, like the laws of physics, couldn't be overcome. The idea of submarines keeping up with enemy forces that had bypassed them, for example. This could in theory be done with the high surface speed of the Japanese Navy's largest subs, but in reality the need of these subs to submerge during the day to stay safe from visual detection meant that unless the enemy fleet's rate of progress was around 12 knots or less, the submarines would relatively quickly be left behind due to their slow speed of advance during the day. Problems with the Type A's trying to coordinate with other subs when they also had to submerge regularly to avoid detection and attack from enemy aircraft led to a small acceleration in the plans for building the Agano and Oyodo class cruisers, which could ostensibly take their place, carry more aircraft, and be relatively immune from the odd enemy scouting plane, which was the main expected opposition that far behind the lines. At the end of 1940, an exercise was held off the Japanese coast, and this one did actually look at the potential of submarine-based commerce raiding offensives. The Japanese used a shore-based command system similar to that which had been adopted by the Kriegsmarine to control its U-boats, and the Japanese submarines were highly successful, netting well over 100 simulated kills against, obviously, Japanese merchant ships during the course of this exercise. But the Japanese Navy concluded that the lesson was not that commerce raiding could be very effective and its own merchant fleet was highly vulnerable, which was the case, but rather that submarines in near constant communication with a home base were highly vulnerable to high-frequency direction-finding detection. Which was in and of itself actually true, but had rather missed the larger aforementioned point. Of course, the war opened not with an attempt to provoke the US Navy out for a decisive battle, but an attempt to annihilate the Pacific Fleet entirely with an aerial assault on December the 5th, 1941. By this point, the Japanese Navy had 48 large submarines and 15 smaller vessels on its rolls, with more under construction. The smaller vessels were really only capable of defensive operations close to home, or potentially offensive operations as long as they had a forward base or supply ship to work with. So it was the larger subs that would have to help out with the Kira Butai's attack. These larger subs were divided into 6 squadrons. The first 3 were for attacking the US Navy directly and possessed the latest submarines. The next two squadrons backstopped them and contained a mixture of newer and older subs, and the last squadron was made up of the mine layers. 30 of these submarines would be assigned to the Pearl Harbor operation in 4 major roles. The advanced scouting role consisted of I-26 and I-10, which went to check out various island chains along the route of the Kido Butai to ensure that there were no forward-based American ships or submarine tenders or seaplane tenders with attendant seaplanes out there prowling that might spot the carriers. Once they'd satisfied themselves that this had not occurred, they joined the fleet containment subs, which were spread out around Oahu to try and snipe off any American ships that emerged from the fleet base after it was attacked. 3 submarines were put into a force protection detachment, which was assigned to the Kido Butai itself, and the last force was confusingly named Counterattack Defense, and aimed to provide a concentration of subs along the vector to the Kido Butai, further out than the containment force, which was closer to the Hawaiian Islands but had to cover multiple vectors and was therefore more dispersed, but not with the Kido Butai itself, which was what the Force Protection Detachment was for. Part of the Fleet Containment Force also included the Special Attack Group that was carrying 5 midget submarines for infiltration into Pearl Harbor. Of course, on December 7th, as we know, no full-sized Japanese Navy submarine was engaged, and all of the midget subs would be lost, with one of them potentially having reached its target. The main fleet subs would have to do better than that. 2 days later, I-9 looked like it might do better than that. It spotted a carrier heading out to sea. Under the mistaken belief that all surviving US Navy units would be promptly fleeing for the west coast, a number of submarines were ordered to head east to pursue and destroy the ship, which turned out to be the USS Enterprise. Of course, Enterprise was not running for the hills, and this resulted in the Japanese submarines being somewhat out of position for their attacks, although thanks to the reports from I-9, they did at least manage to find the ship and launch 2 separate attacks, but both of these were without success. Enterprise struck back when a patrolling Dauntless spotted the I-70 trying to get into position. The Dauntless then crippled it with a near miss from the bomb that it carried, and the submarine was finished off later in the day by another Dauntless. The 5 submarines that had brought their midget subs with them were also ordered to go looking for them, and between these 2 orders, the submarine cordon around Pearl Harbor pretty much disintegrated as an effective unit, which allowed not only the Enterprise, but also Lexington, Saratoga, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and a little bit later on Yorktown, along with numerous smaller ships, to transit in and out of Pearl Harbor in the subsequent few weeks, when their track charts show that if the submarine cordon had remained in place as originally planned, a good number of these ships would have practically run straight over the waiting Japanese submarines. That isn't to say that the deployment of all these subs was entirely without result. At least half a dozen small vessels were sunk by submarines involved in the operation, but compared to the effort expended, and certainly what could have been, this was essentially negligible. Not helped by strict rules about how many torpedoes could be expended on any given target type, which meant that if a certain number of torpedoes were fired and missed, the Japanese submarine commanders did not feel they could continue their attack except via deck gun, and if their target was too far away or too well protected to engage in a gun duel, they'd just have to let it go, even if they technically still had valid torpedo firing solutions. To be honest, more important at this stage was the intelligence the submarines had passed on. Clearing the way for the Kido Butai to approach and verifying that Enterprise was still active in the aftermath of the attack was actually quite useful to know. It would also be I-9 that used its scout plane on the 16th of December to verify the results of the aerial assault a week before. Over in the southwest Pacific, things were a little different. The submarine mine layers did their job, whilst the remaining larger submarines in Squadrons 4 and 5 screened transport convoys and formed picket lines off of Singapore. Although I-58 failed to land any hits on Force Z for the 5 torpedoes that she loosed, her reports of the formation's location, course, and speed were vital for the Japanese Navy attack aircraft to establish where to look for them in the assault that would ultimately sink Prince of Wales and Repulse. The lack of significant Allied fleet assets in the aftermath of those first few days of primarily aerial assaults blunted the ability of Japanese Navy subs in the area to do much about the remaining Allied warships, which remained mostly in and around their bases, apart from a few high-speed cruiser-led forays, which occurred at speeds that were well in excess of a battle fleet's cruising speed and were thus far beyond the ability of all but the luckiest submarines to do anything about. And that was effectively if the cruisers somehow managed to basically run straight over their positions. There were also issues with doctrine and communications. The honor-bound doctrines of the Japanese Navy meant that submarines remaining off of Hawaii would surface and conduct rather anemic shore bombardments to show that they'd done at least something before they left. The US Navy rapidly figured out what these apparently random bombardments meant, and when they occurred, they were thus able to move ships out of the most likely projected return paths of the submarines in question, which denied them any further targets. As well as the I-70, the Japanese Navy lost the RO-66 and RO-60 in 1941, although both of these were operational accidents, namely a collision with a sister ship and running into a reef respectively, whilst they and other RO-type submarines were trying to support the attack on Wake Island. 1942 opened with attempts to rework the situation. 9 submarines were ordered to the US West Coast to interdict supply ships, reinforcing warships, and returning damaged ships heading to and from Pearl Harbor. But this further diminished the submarine cordon off of Pearl Harbor, and with many of the reallocated subs already having taken part in the chase of Enterprise, they were relatively quickly forced to return to refuel. Although their operations off the west coast only sank a few small targets of opportunity, the fact that Japanese warships of any kind were off the US coast caused quite a bit of consternation amongst the public, completely disproportionate to the submarine's actual effects. If anything, the patrols of old US battleships, which were done mostly to reassure the public, and which had begun shortly after Pearl Harbor, were probably far more of a hindrance than help to the US war effort, as after all, if there was any military target that the Japanese subs stood a good chance of taking out, it was an old, slow battleship with relatively minimal modern torpedo defense systems slowly wandering up and down an ostensibly friendly coast without any blackout imposed. Luckily, the battleship patrols didn't run into the Japanese subs in the very brief time that they were both in the same operational area. This dilution of force would continue into the early months of 1942 and frankly didn't help. In February, 7 submarines were taken away from the front line in an attempt to support the attack on Pearl Harbor again, this time from the air using long-range H-8K MLE flying boats. The submarines would act as fuel points and navigation markers. Technically, the mission was a success in that the flying boats did actually make it to Hawaii, but practically it was an abject failure as, thanks to minor navigation errors and cloud cover, not only did the aircraft fail to locate Pearl Harbor at all, but when they decided to randomly bomb some mountains instead, no one actually noticed for a while, until later on the US Navy got a call to ask where all these new craters had come from and why the local residents' windows had been broken by mysterious explosions. A total of 42 merchant ships would be caught and sunk by Japanese subs as incidental parts of their operations in the first 3 months of 1942, whilst only 3 military or close to military ships were claimed during a similar time period. On Christmas Day 1941, the Dutch submarine K-16 was torpedoed by I-66, and on the 11th of January 1942, a US Army cargo ship named the Liberty, which is not a Liberty ship, was hit, again by I-66, which was having a relatively decent start to its war, being responsible for a number of those merchant ship sinkings as well. The Liberty was crippled by the hit and then beached as she was taking on far too much water to tow to safety. And then on the 23rd of January, the valuable oiler USS Neches, or Nietzsche's, maybe? Neches? I don't know, was torpedoed by the I-72. Also notable, on the 11th of January, I-6 managed to get a good launch on the USS Saratoga. The big aircraft carrier was hit, but not sunk, as I-6 initially reported, but Saratoga would be out of the war for the next 6 months, which would have important effects further down the line. Significant reconnaissance efforts were also made off of various Australian and New Zealand ports in preparation for subsequent operations, and these would bear fruit a little bit later on. April would see 6 of the older large subs sent into the Indian Ocean supporting Operation C, and here they claimed a total of 7 cargo ships, being somewhat outshone by the far more dramatic successes of the Kido Butai in taking out the small carrier HMS Hermes and the heavy cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire, along with a number of merchant ships and other smaller vessels. In exchange for all this effort, the Japanese Navy would lose a further 3 submarines in early 1942, although each actually had a fairly interesting nature of loss. All 3 losses occurred in late January, starting on the 12th with I-60. The destroyer HMS Jupiter was escorting the US troopship Mount Vernon when a distress call nearby spoke of a submarine in the area. Jupiter began a search and soon found a contact with her ASDIC set. 2 passes with depth charges later, and the damaged I-60 popped up to the surface so close to the destroyer that her 4.7-inch guns couldn't depress far enough down to shoot. The badly damaged sub clearly couldn't submerge again without it being a terminal operation, and so it instead opened fire with its own 4.7-inch deck gun and a machine gun mounted on the sail. Jupiter moved to open the range and hose the sub down in return with a 20mm Oerlikon, but the Japanese captain kept sending out more and more of his men as the Oerlikon wiped out one gun crew after another. One of the shells it fired hit Jupiter and crippled her forward twin 4.7-inch mount, which cut her firepower by a third. Trying to finish things quickly, the destroyer fired a pair of torpedoes as soon as they'd passed through the minimum arming distance, but the rapidly changing courses and speeds of both vessels meant that both of the torpedoes missed. Next, the remaining 2 4.7-inch twin mounts opened up as the range had opened sufficient for the depression to work, and they scored a number of hits, finally silencing the Japanese submarine's deck gun. The destroyer then closed in again, the Oerlikon silencing the machine gun, and another 4.7-inch hit along with a depth charge set to detonate at a shallow setting as the destroyer passed by, finally finished the submarine off, leaving only 3 survivors, 1 mortally wounded, from a crew of around 90. Despite being a relatively large J-class destroyer, I-63 had actually outmassed Jupiter by a couple of 100 tons. The size and armament present on Japanese Navy subs would prove them to be considerably harder targets to engage on the surface than most other Axis submarines. Soon thereafter, near Darwin, Australia, the older I-123, equipped with more traditionally powered torpedoes, tried to attack the fleet oiler USS Trinity. This attack failed, thanks to the older torpedoes leaving a wake which was spotted by its escorts, and after a depth charging by those escorts brought no results, a trio of Royal Australian Navy Bathurst-class corvettes was sent out from Darwin, since the attack had taken place only about 40 miles away. I-23 had actually just escaped, but I-124, her sister ship, had shown up and tried to torpedo HMS Deloraine, the first corvette to reach the area. A series of depth charge attacks by the angry Australians in return, plus the arrival of a Kingfisher from the nearby USS Langley, saw the submarine briefly surface with a hard list and then sink back to the bottom. But as the bottom of the sea was only 150 foot down, this was well above crush depth and she remained otherwise intact. Then first Deloraine, then Lithgow, and then Katoomba gradually expended their depth charges on what seemed on ASDIC to be a slowly moving target. Perhaps I-124 was trying to creep away, heavily damaged. At the time, of course, they thought they might be engaging multiple targets. This barrage went on all afternoon, with the corvettes cycling back one by one to reload their depth charges as they ran out, and the USS Edsall and Alden, having seen the Trinity to safety, returned to the area to add their own depth charges to the effort. Everything was cooled off overnight, the ships came back in the morning, and more depth charges were dropped, and by the time the whole thing was cooled off permanently at noon the following day, they were pretty sure that they'd sunk 3 Japanese submarines. In fact, there was just one extremely battered I-124 on the bottom, although subsequent investigations of the wreck showed that for all the battering she had received, the hull was surprisingly intact, all things considered. It was at least still in, roughly speaking, one piece. Finally, I-73 was the unintentional victim of Allied code breaking. USS Gudgeon, a Tambor-class submarine, was informed by Ultra that I-18, I-22 and I-24 were on their way back home from Hawaii and were likely to pass her position. Unknown to the US Navy, I-71, 72 and 73 were also on their way on a reciprocal bearing to take over the patrol stations. Gudgeon headed for her targets and failed to find them. Then she heard something moving at speed in the other direction on the surface. Gudgeon's periscope went up, and the bemused crew watched I-73 slowly overtaking her. 3 Mark 14s were launched, after all, waste not, want not when it comes to these kinds of opportunities, and this resulted in 2 explosions and the disappearance of I-73. But Gudgeon heard no breakup noises, only a cessation of propeller activity, and so claimed that the target had been damaged. However, when she got back to port, she discovered that US intelligence claimed that she had in fact killed the I-73, thus making it the first warship to be sunk by a US submarine. There are some competing claims that Gudgeon was actually right and I-73 had only been damaged, perhaps by premature detonation of the Mark 14s, that being something of a problem at the time, and that she was subsequently sunk by USS Jarvis the next day. But unless and until someone goes poking around the 2 rather distant and separate reported positions, both in rather deep parts of the Pacific Ocean, we won't know for sure. 6 submarines were also dispatched in April to support the invasion of Port Moresby, the operation that would eventually lead to the Battle of the Coral Sea. Their mission was to recon the area and attack any enemy warships they found. I-21 was part of this group, and she actually spotted the outer edges of the American escort formation that was protecting Lexington and Yorktown. But, relying only on her periscope, as opposed to the scout plane which she carried for exactly this kind of situation, she failed to register the presence of the carriers, which might have led to a preemptive submarine strike on the 2 carriers before the battle itself commenced by half a dozen Japanese subs. But her failure to conduct proper recon meant that Lexington and Yorktown proceeded to the battle unmolested, and the historical Battle of the Coral Sea unfolded. This would have a number of impacts on Japanese submarine operations going forward, so we'll leave it here for the moment and try and pick up again at some point in the future, where we'll see how Coral Sea, and then Midway, affected Imperial Japanese Navy submarine operations for the rest of 1942.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.